You know, my dears, I did not have to recreate everything because it did save after all. Like, I managed to save it after finishing up the recording. But yeah, since it was between streaming today and between recording more Lamento, I decided to record more Lamento because, I don't know, didn't really feel like streaming anything particular. Alright, Asato wanting us to escape, but I'm going to ask him what he's gonna do. Before Konoe could tell him to stop, Asato lowered his stance and plunged into the front lane at full force. Asato smoothly drew his dark, gleaming sword.
Asato!
The elder was the first to raise his growling voice. Then, all at once, the cats of Kira attacked Asato. As Asato began to fight back against them, he drew them to the left. Several remaining cats growled threateningly at Konoe. Clicking his tongue, Konoe immediately ran towards his right. He didn't know what was going on, but he didn't want to let Asato's efforts go to waste. So we are running after all. Cool. He could feel them chasing after him. He had no escape. He thought this fervently as he weaved through the night, slipping past the area dotted with houses. As if to tear through even his thoughts, one cat caught up with Konoe and slashed at him with his sword. Konoe pulled out his sword to immediately parry the blow then retaliated. Oh my god, I'm really having struggles today, I'm sorry. The cat staggered, then bared his fangs and lashed out at Konoe with his opposite hand. Sharp claws grazed Konoe's cheek. His heart beat harshly. It was coming, just as he thought. His emotional empathy. A sharp pain ran through his body. There was a weight on his chest as he tried to control his emotions. He clenched his teeth. This is... Oh my god, the game broke again. Oh, let me click out real quick. Hello? Why is this always happening at decisions? Ugh. Hello, game. Ah, okay. I think this is starting where, the part is starting where decisions actually make an impact. Should I become sad, feel pleasant, or delighted? I'm gonna go with sad for now, actually. His chest was crushed. An extraordinarily sad feeling touched him, and he felt like tears would overflow from his eyes at any moment. Whenever the emotions clashed, it was like billowing waves filling him with hatred. Hatred. This feeling was completely different from what he felt with the bandits. It ran deep inside him like a profoundly muddy stream. It continued to crush his heart. Nevertheless, he couldn't stop. Konoe couldn't compare to the Kiran cats in build or fighting style. The other cats sped up and caught up with Konoe, their attacks accelerating to overtake him. One kicked off the ground and leapt at Konoe, swinging a large sword at him at full force. Konoe brandished his own sword and held it over his head to block the airborne attack. In a split second, the sharp tip of a thin sword was thrust out at his side. Impressed that I didn't stumble there. Konoe evaded by jumping to the side, then kicked his feet and pushed forward. Right in front of his nose was the cat who had struck at him just moments ago. He lunged forward and met sword with sword. In a split second, he growled threateningly and thrust his left arm out towards the cat's face. A scream rent the air. Damn. Konoe dug his claws into the cat's face, then moved his hand to his windpipe. Red oozed from the gaps between his fingers where he'd clawed at the skin. He could feel the cat's hot pulse against the palm of his hand. But Konoe had no intention of killing him. There was no time. Konoe released his throat. The thick blood sticking to his hands shone in the edge of his vision. A ferocious impulse filled him. A growl escaped from his lips. At that moment, as if he'd lost the strength in his body, he fell to his knees as pain raged through him. Sweat trickled from his temple down his cheeks and dripped off of his chin. Konoe didn't know if the grinding sound he heard was his teeth clenching or a headache. La. The Kiran cats were strong. Without caring about his own appearance, Konoe lifted his sword, bare his fangs, and ran off. Shaking off the cats pursuing him, Konoe ran from Kira as if tearing through the darkness. His feet felt slow. He stepped harder on the mud, aiming for the cliffs. He recklessly ran on. Dragging his tail, Konoe climbed up where the slopes were less steep. He pushed hard with his legs and desperately kicked off, never looking back. He climbed back up again. He finally made it up the cliffs and began to run a bit further, but suddenly his body relaxed. Like a toy that had lost its screws, he abruptly fell to the ground. He felt leaves and twigs against his cheek, and he smelled the earth. His lungs felt like they were crushed, and Konoe took a painful, labored breaths. He no longer saw the fog. The numbness made him fail to notice that the empathetic pain was relieved considerably, and he didn't feel the presence of any pursuers either. He raised his head and looked around. He was in the forest. He'd made it back. Konoe slowly took in deep breaths. Meanwhile, in Kira. The elder laughed triumphantly. Asato, who had lured away the rampaging Kiran cats, was cornered at the outskirts of the village. He was surrounded, their bloodlust overflowing. Everyone glared at Asato with frightening eyes. Many of them growled threateningly. Why always this word? It's so hard to read. Asato held his sword low and watched as the ring of cats surrounding him gradually tightened up. The elder growled with vicious disgust. As if also provoked, the surrounding cats slowly growled as well. Surrounded by this whirlpool of rage, Asato calmly observed the Kiran cats. Kira respected its families and honored its traditions and bloodlines above all else. Though they were moody, things rarely got rough. But then there was the case of the Meigi, the evil tribe with whom Kira was always on hateful terms. The eye of the elder and the other cats were no longer sane. Eyes. He worried about the sudden strange change. Strange change. Asato remembered. They'd called Konoe a spy. Was it true? He suddenly felt doubtful, but while he faced the cats surrounding him, a shadow suddenly blurred his visions, then disappeared. It was a tall shadow that stood some way off in silence. Vivid red hair swayed in the dusky breeze. It appeared to be observing them. It seemed to be laughing. Was it a cat of Kira? Asato wondered if there was such a person here. He strained his eyes uncomfortably. Something stuck up from his temple. Something stuck up from its temple, too sharp to be an ear. Huh? Wait, could it be?
貴様の母親もとんだ猫を産んだものだ。いや、猫ですらないわ。我らにあだなす意味語、化け物め。
The elder spat with a sneer. Asato immediately looked at him. He forgot about that shadow. The sound of something breaking tore him from his calm thoughts. Encouraged, they began to speak one after the other. Their words weighed on him in succession, words full of malice, words that Asato did not want to hear. Unbearable impulses rose inside of him. Intense rage spiraled up his spine and burst out, rushing out of him. Asato couldn't take it any longer. He could take no more than this. I am not a monster.
Yamero.
Asato's voice sounded like it was writhing over the earth. It cracked. He unconsciously bared his fangs. His entire body stiffened and trembled. He desperately tried to hold back his rage, but he couldn't restrain himself. Asato glared at the cat surrounding him, strange sensations flooding over him. From the depths of his stomach, he let out a roar. That deep howl made the cats of Kira freeze up. The cat stepped back, eyes fearful, as if awoken. The elder bitterly clicked his tongue and daringly stepped forward out of the retreating circle. He hissed softly in threat and calmly regarded Asato.
いいか、よく聞け。あの猫を逃がしたのはお前だ。お前の責任だ。奴をここへ連れ戻すか、もしくは殺せ。名義のものであれば生かしておくわけにはいかん。
I love the assumptions that he's making. If he's Meigi, he shall not live. But what if he isn't?
これは命令だ。
命令だ。
失敗は許さん。
Okay. He finished speaking, emphasizing his final words, then looked to the Kiran cats to signal them back. The ring surrounding Asato dispersed, and the black flames faded from the eyes of the Kiran cats. The intense impulse burning at Asato's body disappeared as well, but he kept staring intensely at the elder and the village cats. The elder had ordered it. For the cats of Kira, it was something tied to their very blood. It was absolute. Disobeying a command was like defiling the existence of Kira. They didn't know any other way to live. The thought of abandoning Kira, just thinking of it, it seemed like a fate worse than death. Asato was no exception. Even if everyone hated him, and Asato cursed the thought, he could do nothing but obey. It was etched into his very consciousness. As if resisting, Asato bared his fangs and growled lowly, but in the end he turned his face away, as if something was leading him. Without looking back, he ran through the dispersed ring of Kiran cats, past the elder. He ran in the direction where Konoe had escaped. It was an order. Konoe, the cursed cat, different from the people of Kira. Kill him. If you didn't kill him, Asato wouldn't be able to return to his village. As if to reassure himself, he repeated that to himself over and over, while he ran from the dark village. Kill Konoe. It was simple. Why should he hesitate to kill a cat he'd only gotten acquaintance with the day before? If what the elders said was true, and Konoe really was a Meigi, then he couldn't let him escape with his life. But he had such pretty eyes. Asato remembered them vividly. When they faced each other, Konoe's eyes were honest and unafraid. They'd startled him when he first saw them. They were strong-willed and powerful. The light that shone in the eyes of the Kiran cats was brave, but it was nothing more than the urge to fight and kill. They were empty. Besides that, Konoe had also said, he said he was beautiful too. Someone like him. Unable to stand these emotions any longer, Asato grit his teeth. Why was he so conflicted? He had to kill him. He would kill him. Asato solemnly told himself only that. Dragging his weary body, Konoe pushed aside the tall grass. In the depths of the forest, he leaned against the trunk of a tall tree and let out a quiet sigh. He sat down without thinking of anything, but luckily the place hasn't been touched by the void yet. He didn't want to move. Anything else seemed impossible. Konoe instantly closed his eyes. When his view was shut off, his other senses became sharper. The cold wind rocking the treetops tickled the fur on his ears. What happened to the cats of Kira? The hair all over his body stood on end as he remembered the ferocity of their emotions. Something was wrong. He'd felt the same things with the bandits too. Suddenly he remembered the clown, Firi. The presence of a third party, someone whose name or face Konoe didn't know, was watching him, laughing, beckoning, manipulating him. The thoughts flooded into his mind suddenly. Could that be it? But one thought struck him above anything else. The bandits and the Kiran cats had also been manipulated. But why? For what purpose? This series of events seemed like a nightmare to him. It was too strange, so Konoe was unable to connect the realities inside him. He couldn't tie them together. Konoe wondered if, back in Kira, Asato was alright. He was kind to him and had helped him escape. When they were surrounded, the Kiran cats had turned their hatred towards Asato. He could never forget the eyes of the Kiran elder, watching Asato like he was looking at something detestable. Poor boy. Konoe pulled a flask from his drawstring bag and lapped up some water. The lukewarm water didn't quiet his muddy thoughts. Konoe sighed. From between the dark trees, the pale light of the night moon quietly poured down. He felt like it had been an insanely long time since he'd seen it. Even though he probably shook the Kira cats chasing him, there may have been more pursuers. He always kept his ears pricked to survey his surroundings. The sound of the wind, a strange cry from the stirring trees. Apart from that, he didn't hear anything in particular. Slowly, Konoe lay down. His empathy pains had completely dissipated now. He'd rather just have all his feelings disappear from his own soul. He wanted to be freed. If he could do that, then he wouldn't suffer so much. The words sank little by little into his exhausted thoughts. Then, a sound pushed in. Different sounds. Konoe jumped up, his ears twitched. Footsteps? A sound of the trees and plants being pushed aside and the earth being kicked up. Something was running at great speed. It was coming this way. A pursuer from Kira? His body was heavy as lead, but he immediately got up to run away. A dark mass leapt out of the foliage. The body tangled with his own and they fell to the ground. Hissing in violent threat, they grappled with each other, aiming for hair and skin. Konoe couldn't recognize the figure. For a moment, he wondered if it was a monster, but there was something familiar about its scent. Their throats shouted with heated growls. Even though they brandished no weapons, they fought wildly. Konoe bit the ear of his opponent, who'd pinned him to the ground, then kneed him in the stomach with all his might. A growl of pain and anger sounded from overhead. Konoe felt an ache in his throat, too. It had been bitten. Claws sank into his shoulder. In the middle of their fighting, something flooded into his chest. The emotions of his opponent. Konoe tried to control himself so they didn't enter too deeply, imagining an invisible wall in his soul that blocked them out. Don't come in. But while he struggled against his opponent, Konoe felt a mysterious feeling. He knew this feeling well. A familiar emotion that came in waves.
Asato!
Before he could process the thought, Konoe blurted out the name. Asato's body twitched. Asato. Just like he thought. He was slightly relieved, but just for a moment. Konoe's eyes widened at the low mutter in his ear. Kill him? Why? Konoe tried to reflexively hold on to doubt, but his thoughts soon changed. It made sense, if you thought about it, because Asato was also Kira's cat. A Kira cat, whoops. Still, he was considerably shocked when he began to consider it more. Konoe remembered Asato's modest and reserved gaze. Konoe was confused, but suddenly a strong pain surged through his shoulder. He'd been bitten. He'd grimaced in pain. This was real pain, and there was no time to think. If he wasted any more time, he'd be killed. Clenching his teeth to bear the intense pain in his shoulder, Konoe gathered up his power in his low abdomen. He clung to Asato's body and kicked his knees into the other cat's stomach with all his might. Once. Twice. He felt the presence of his breathing begin to fade. The fangs dug into his shoulder, pulled away, but a hand now tightened around Konoe's throat. It closed in, strangling him. His sight blurred from the oncoming suffocation. In his dimming view, Konoe's eyes met Asato's for the first time. When their eyes met, he almost relaxed. There was no hatred or anger in Asato's eyes. Asato's face was frowning as if he were about to cry. It wasn't from the pain of Konoe's attacks. Asato's eyebrows were knitted tight and he looked like a helpless child who was doing something terrible. Even while he made such a face, Asato steadily constricted Konoe's throat. Konoe needed him to stop. Konoe lifted one hand with what was left of his strength and lashed out at Asato's face. A low growl sounded at the tightening on his throat, and the tightening on his throat loosened. He used both hands to push away the cat on top of him, crawling along the ground to escape from Asato. Trying to catch him again, Asato reached an arm out towards him. When Konoe twisted his body, he saw a tail with short black hair out of the corner of his eyes. With no time to think, he grabbed it and bit the tip. Now it's gonna be crooked like his. Asato let out a yelp of pain as he trembled and fell down. The tail was a weak spot, but while he was trying to catch Konoe, he seemed to have become a bit careless. After throwing Asato off him completely, Konoe clung to the ground, hung his head and coughed violently. Konoe couldn't shake the feeling of bile raising in his throat, and he felt nauseous. Several drops of saliva spilled down. He felt someone getting up behind him and looked back. He was still determined. His tail stood on end and bristled out. Asato knelt down. His shoulders were rising and falling heavily with his breathing, and he bared his fangs while glaring at Konoe. In addition to a murderous urge, though, Konoe saw a perplexed light flickering in his deep blue eyes.
お前
He was all over the place, in thought and action. Konoe thought this as he looked into Asato's eyes. Still confused, Konoe stared Asato down as if to challenge him.
俺を殺すのか
Asato's shoulders shook in surprise. He clenched both hands into fists.
俺はお前を殺す。殺さなきゃならない。長の命令だから。じゃないと。
His awkward words staggered as he gasped for air. Konoe narrowed his eyes and watched Asato. Why did he seem so pained? They'd only exchanged a few words over the course of the night. He wanted to know what Asato was feeling, and not just through his barely restrained empathy. If he did, he'd know, but he didn't want that. Konoe didn't want to use that power to peer into the hearts of others. He didn't ask for that. He wanted to speak, to hear it expressed through words. When he tried to ask, he was unable to. There was the sharp sound of something slicing the air, and when they faced each other, a dazzling light shot past them. He was blinded. A whir of wind passed by a split second later, and their clothes and hair fluttered. What was it? The sound of an explosion followed right after. He looked behind him. Black smoke rose from the ground a short distance away. Konoe caught the scent of something singed. Then he turned to look where the light had come from. Before them, hidden in the dark groves, stood a red shadow. Vivid red and swaying like heat waves. Was it a cat? Their brows furrowed uneasily. Two ears protruded from the head of the shadow. They seemed off. They weren't ears at all. Oh, is this the first one of them, guys? Asato was watching too, and suddenly his body stiffened.
あいつは
知ってるのか
村で見た。
あ、
みんながおかしくなってる時に。
え
Konoe heard the sound of a sharp wind again. Again, that light. They jumped to the side and lay down on the ground. Pew, pew, pew. He met eyes with Asato, who jumped the other way from Konoe, and as they lifted their faces, there was another explosion. It passed before their eyes. The red shadow was gradually coming closer. They saw its lips smiling thinly, and both of them shivered.
あいつ一体何なんだ
わからない。ただ、あの頭から生えているものは角じゃないのか。
角
Asato nodded without taking his eyes off the red shadow.
牙よりも太い角を生やし、固く艶やかな尾を持った邪悪な存在。邪神信仰の儀式などで召喚することがあると聞いた。
If that was the case, Konoe had heard about them too. But it was only spoken of in legend. No one he knew had ever seen one. He always thought they were just stories and dreams.
あれがそうだっていうのかそんなのがなんでこんなところにいるんだ
わからない。けど、村のみんなをおかしくしたのも。
Okay. Asato stopped speaking and keenly narrowed his eyes. The shadow was in the darkness, so he couldn't see its features until it came closer. Just like Asato said, those things growing out of its head were definitely not ears. They were horns, thick and long like fangs. His heart beat. The red snake. Its shadow slithered through his mind. The marks on his body stirred. Why was this happening now? Konoe had no time to think of an answer. The shadow slowly lifted its hand and aimed it at Konoe. Dazzling light burst forth. He kicked off the dirt and jumped towards Asato. Bitch is being shooten at! Right after the explosion roared in his ears, a burning sand drifted and gripped his chest. The ground where Konoe had stood just a moment before was now a hollow crater giving off smoke. If it was something like Asato said, they had no hope of winning. When Konoe got up, a scathing pain ran through his chest. He frowned and staggered.
コノエ、なんでもない。
The pain. It was the same as when he empathized with someone, but there was no one around him. Was it because of the red shadow? Putting away his unrest and doubt, Konoe grabbed Asato's arm and ran. He didn't know in which direction they ran. Sometimes he saw spheres of light exploding right beside them. Each time it happened, a chill ran down his spine. Konoe ran as fast as he could, and their opponent was slow. Even so, the distance between them didn't seem to increase. Was it still after them? He ran through the gaps between the trees, bounding over their protruding roots. Suddenly, he felt like the atmosphere around them shifted. The scene reflected in their view was still the same, but there was definitely something there. Asato's body fell forward. His movement stopped as if he were frozen, and he knelt down on the ground.
おい、どうした？この辺りは。
Asato watched Konoe, his expression stiff. His short-furred black tail raised up in front of his eyes. There was a mark on the tip, the fur stained with blood. When Konoe looked at him, as if to ask whether or not he was hurt, Asato shook his head.
草に当たっただけだ。
The words made Konoe's blood run cold. Konoe looked around. At first glance, nothing appeared to have changed in the forest night. But if Konoe looked more closely, he could see that the colors shone vividly, even though they should have been shrouded in darkness. The grass, the trees, and the leaves, they all seemed to emit light on their own. It was brilliant, as if it was poisonous. Konoe touched a fingertip to a fallen leaf, and a thin red line ran over the pad of his finger. It had been rejected.
うつろか。
Konoe clicked his tongue. Since when had this place been eroded so far? If they kept running into the depths of the woods unaware, their bodies may have been sliced apart by the leaves, branches, and grass. He turned around. The red shadow didn't speed up and steadily approached them, one hand raised up slowly. There was nothing else they could do. When Konoe looked at Asato, he seemed to be thinking exactly the same. Powerful eyes looked back at him.
動けるか？ああ。
Asato nodded and stood.
あいつの狙いは俺だ。このまま突っ込む。わかった。
For now, they didn't need to say any more than that. There was no room to weave past him, and neither of them knew what else they could do. Konoe crouched down and glared at the advancing shadow. The shadow laughed at him. The tail of the red snake wrinkled inside Konoe, making him rather nauseous. Red flashed through his vision as the wicked heatwave swayed. At the same time, a spherical light was cast. Konoe pushed his body forward. He felt Asato move behind him. The light flashes and explosives repeatedly. Konoe kept running closer, barely avoiding being hit by that light. He felt heat graze his cheek, and his hair fluttered as the light flew past. The shadow approached before his eyes, and it raised its hand, greatly opening its palm. Light was created. There was something that flew overhead. Konoe clashed with the red shadow, then jumped and rolled to the side. Asato, who had been hidden in the darkness of the trees, leapt into the air. He swung his sword, bearing it down upon the red shadow's head. A heavily confined sound echoed. He did it. But there was neither blood nor the screams Konoe was expecting, even though the attack had certainly hit its mark. The red shadow's figure wavered and slowly sank down to its knees. Flowing crimson hair covered its face. Asato watched the shadow's kneeling posture where it had landed right in front of Konoe. There was a strained silence, as if time had stopped. They gasped when the sound of something breaking reached their ears. What Konoe saw left him speechless. A crack ran down from the kneeling figure's face, coursing down to his chest. Like ivy, the the cracks sprawled out over its entire body until finally the red shadow broke into countless tiny pieces, letting out a delicate sound. Metal mixed with the red fragments that caught the light of the moon of shadow and glittered as they scattered to the wind, drifting to the forest floor like red snow. It was beautiful, Konoe thought, even at a time like this.
Konoe!
Konoe heard Asato call him and snapped back to his senses. Asato ran to him, his sword in his hands.
怪我はないか? ああ、そっちは大丈夫だ.
Asato nodded and looked towards where the red shadow once stood. His profile showed a vivid, complex color reflected clearly in his eyes. Konoe felt uneasy and lightheaded. Nothing seemed real. It was like he'd just emerged from a dream. It was disappointing. That was his honest impression. Why did such a wicked existence from legend fall so easily? There was a hole in his heart that told him something was missing here. The red shard that floated through the sky gradually faded and disappeared. The air itself seemed to be glowing with color. He watched the fantastic sight for a while, but then remembered his own predicament. Konoe narrowed his eyes to the left, towards the road he'd continued to take. In the jet-black darkness of night, the trees and flowers glowed with a vivid, too beautiful light. It was the poison of the void.
とりあえず、ここから離れよう。ああ。
I love how Asato went from, oh, I'm gonna kill you to, oh, okay, let's just go. They returned to the path they'd run down. Exposed in the lonely moonlight were many hollowed-out tree trunks and earth. Asato let out a sharp sigh. When Konoe glanced at him, he saw fatigue hanging on the edge of his expression. If you thought about it, walking shoulder to shoulder with Asato like this was strange. Just a few minutes ago, they'd been a hunter and the hunted. That's what I'm saying. By the way, we have met 2 out of 3 love interests by now. Rebecca didn't usually work together, but when they faced the same enemy, Asato's body moved naturally. This was the first time Konoe hadn't fought alone, and it must have been the same for Asato. Konoe couldn't feel any bloodlust from Asato now. When Asato attacked him earlier, why did he look like he was ready to cry? Konoe wanted to know why. Slowly walking in exhausted silence, the 2 of them looked for a place where they could rest. Now returning to a place where the void hadn't yet reached, they leaned against the root of a great tree as if to hide. The fatigue made him feel like his feet sank into the ground whenever he took a step. When they finally sat down, both were silent. Asato grabbed his tail and licked at the wound on the tip where a void leaf had sliced into it. His tongue, peeking out occasionally, was red. Konoe pondered as he gazed at him unconsciously. It stood out against his dark skin and hair. It was like his tongue was a separate organism. Asato noticed and looked up at him. Their eyes met and they just stared at each other.
いや、結局何だったんだ、さっきの。
猫ならざる者。あくまで間違いないとは思う。けど、何かおかしかった。
His tail swayed in agreement. The devil moved like a puppet, manipulated by someone else. Therefore, even though it was just a spur-of-the-moment plan, they could pull off such an absurd attack. If they'd misread the situation, they'd be missing their heads by now. Asato stopped licking his injured tail and looked up at the sky, lost in thought.
本体が別にいるのかもしれない。
本体？
悪魔は力を分散させていくつもの写し身を作る。そう聞いてる。
詳しいな。
Asato's gaze slipped towards Konoe.
名義がかつてある悪魔を信仰していた。
名義？
He'd heard stories about a heretical tribe that worshipped evil gods. That reminded him, when the Kirans faced Konoe, he heard them call him a Meigi spy. While Asato watched Konoe, his eyes slowly narrowed. The color of doubt reflected clearly in his eyes, and Konoe furrowed his brows.
なんだよ。
本当に知らないのか。
The sound of his questioning voice irritated Konoe.
知らない。俺は家老の猫だ。
He pushed his chin out and shut back those words, glaring sharply at him. Asato doubted him. He didn't know. He didn't know a single thing about the Meigi. His eyes were forceful, just like his words. Asato stared into Konoe's eyes for a while, but then looked away and sighed before long.
そうか。
名義なら何だって言うんだよ。
殺さなきゃならない。確実に。
Well. Kill. Right. Asato had chased him from Kira to kill him.
どうして？
Asato turned his face away, hitting the ground several times with his tail. The soil made a dry sound.
キラと名義はずっと昔からいがみ合っている。名義はキラを潰そうとして機会を伺っている。長は近衛が名義の猫じゃないかと言っていた。
俺は名義の猫じゃない。
わかってる。けど
Asato furrowed his eyebrows and looked at Konoe with a sad expression.
俺はお前を殺す。
No, you will not. Konoe suddenly jumped back. He didn't feel any murderous impulses from Asato, but he did so instinctively. Asato lowered his ears sadly and didn't do anything more than sit. His expression left Konoe at a loss. I will kill you. The pronunciation of his words revived in Konoe's ears as he reflected on them. But his voice was tinged with something that went against the words he spoke. The eyes that stared at Konoe now didn't have any aggressive light in them. Konoe didn't know what to do.
なんで？どうしてそんな顔するんだ？殺すって言いながら、なんで？
殺したくない。本当は。
I love Asato.
だったら
命令だから。
Asato muttered softly. He lowered his head and feebly swished his tail.
長の命令は絶対だ。逆らうことは許されない。
I mean, you always could.
絶対命令だから殺したくなくても殺すっていうのか？
Asato nodded. What was he saying? He wondered this above all else. Doubt began to gradually turn into anger and he frowned sternly.
絶対なんてあるわけない。長に従うか逆らうのか、そんなのお前次第じゃないか。
長には 逆らえない。逆らえばキラには戻れない。
別にいいだろ、戻れなくても。キラの村でなきゃ生きられないってわけじゃない。
True.
生きられない。
Asato answered him without hesitation, and Konoe's eyes widened. He didn't understand what he meant.
キラの猫はキラしか知らない。キラの外には出られない。
Oh, come on, babe, that's
出
bullshit.
たら生きてはいけない。
That's bullshit.
なんだよそれ。誰かに言われたのか。
長に教わってきた。物心ついた時からずっと。
He just wants to keep his own little cult, you know? Just wants to keep them all around, making sure they don't run away from his stupid regime. These cats. Konoe stared at the black cat before him. His tail felt odd, as if it were numb. It wasn't a bad thing to honor one's traditions and bloodlines. Kira's elder probably did it to bring unity to the members of the village, but at the same time, it isolated their society. If someone died in such a small village, they'd never have known the outside world. The leader's word in such a small group were absolute. Because of that, they had to obey. They had to fight, otherwise they'd be erased. The cats of Kira hadn't realized it yet. No, the problem was more fundamental than that. He felt a chill of resentment. He didn't care at all about that kind of village, and being killed by them was an unbearable thought.
お前が
Konoe took a step closer after having jumped back from Asato.
お前が本気で俺を殺したいって言うなら相手になる。けどキラを出たら生きていけないなんて、そんなのはただの思い込みだ。
Exactly. Asato's eyes flickered with confusion for just a moment. Konoe continued while those eyes watched him intently.
長は嘘を言ってる。キラの外にも世界はずっと広がってる。それを知りたくないか。
キラの外の世界。
あ
あ。Asato was clearly panicked. He couldn't have considered the thought of leaving Kira before, and of course he'd never doubted the elder before either. Konoe's words shook him thoroughly.
それに
Konoe looked down and opened his mouth again.
お前は俺の姿を見ても嫌な顔一つしなかった。俺のこんな姿を見ても。
Ah!
コノエ。
Konoe looked back up.
だから俺はお前と戦いたくない。どうしても俺を殺したいって言うなら長が来ればいいんだ。お前が言うことを聞く必要はない。
Asato's mouth moved as if he wanted to say something, but he bit back his words and lowered his head in the end, eyes narrowing. There was a brief silence. Asato seemed to be desperately trying to sort out his thoughts. It was like the world he'd lived in was turned upside down. Konoe patiently waited until Asato spoke. She looked up at the night moon peeping out between the gaps of the thickly growing foliage. The light was thinned by the overlapping leaves, and only a small amount of it reached the gloomy forest. But for some reason he felt entranced. How much longer until daybreak?
初めてだったんだ。
His voice was forlorn.
綺麗
Forlorn?
って言われたのは。
Pretty? He wondered if he ever said that. When he thought about it, he suddenly remembered. Definitely. In Asato's room, he'd called his fur pretty. But because he really thought Asato looked better, Asato's, he just casually made that retort.
俺は疎まれているから。
疎まれてる。
He asked again, but Asato kept silent, looking down with his ears pressed low. He looked as if he didn't want to say more than that.
家族とかいないのか。それか 何か大切なものは？
ない。大切なものなんて何も。
There was no feeling in the voice that answered back. Asato's hand made a loose fist. There was nothing. He was the same as Konoe. Konoe felt like he could kind of understand how Asato felt. He had also said he was an outcast. That was probably why he was awkward while interacting with others. Very relatable to be honest. I mean, by now they're both outcasts. But because he understood how it felt, he also began to feel a little irritated.
嬉しかったんだ。だから
Oh,
この
baby.
子のことは殺したくない。
Konoe slowly came closer to Asato and sat in front of him. He looked him in the eyes.
だから何度も言ってる。嫌なら従わなければいいんだ。
This
恐ろしいんだ。
But why? As if to avoid Konoe's gaze, Asato lowered his head and scratched at the ground with a single fingernail.
キラを捨てたらどうなるのかがわからない。怖い。
Boy, you are already outside of Kira. You're already outside. What else could you be afraid of, huh? When he heard Asato's frightened words, he felt heat build in the depths of his mind. He answered back in a low, monotonous voice.
それは誰だって同じだろ。
True. Right. It was the same for everyone. For himself, too.